Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Kent Harrington, a former senior CIA analyst who served as National Intelligence Officer for East Asia and Chief of Station in Asia. And he has an article at Project Syndicate, Trump's Blackmail Defense. Welcome to Background Briefing, Kent Harrington.
Thanks very much, Ian.
Let me just quickly touch on a couple of developments. Trump, of course, has asked for a special master. He did a filing in a different court with a judge that he had appointed to help him in his legal battle with the DOJ over the affidavit, etc. But the other big story, Kent, is that the New York Times revealed that Trump had more than 300 classified documents at Mar-a-Lago, and that the National Archives back in January had found more than 150 classified documents when it got its first batch of material. We also learned from the New York Times that Trump went through the boxes himself in late 2021. And apparently these 300 documents, include documents from the CIA, the National Security Agency, and the FBI, spanning a variety of topics on national security interests. So what do you make of that, Ken?
Well, Ian, the Trump attorney's filing seeking a review by a special master strike me as the equivalent of throwing Jell-O at the wall. If it sticks, great. But the fact is the FBI, indeed the Justice Department, already has a procedure in place. And based on other reporting, it appears that procedure is underway to ensure that what was seized were material that were properly seized. And it seems to me that both the nature of the attempt to divert the proceeding, as well as to claim that the documents represent something other than what they are, and that is a potential national security threat that the judge who signed the warrant, the approval for the search of Mar-a-Lago recognized, is just what it appears, a tactic. I think we can expect more coming from the attorneys, and I think we can expect more histrionics from Trump on claims, bogus to be sure, that what's in the boxes belongs to him. On the subject of what's in the boxes, it strikes me that the New York Times story is very important from a couple points of view, perhaps not necessarily the headline that accompanies it. To be sure, if classified information is at the level that the Times is reporting, there is no question that this is a major concern for the intelligence as well as other national security agencies concerned, because not knowing if your material is properly secured when it's of that degree of sensitivity is the equivalent of having to ask whether it's been compromised. And that's something that is really a grave matter that requires a serious and substantial review, and I suspect that is already underway. But the question of how that material was handled, as the Times reported, material reviewed by Trump, material moved from one kind of storage container to another, and material is also, it would appear if the reporting is accurate, removed from the basement storage that was secured in a fashion by surveillance cameras, raises fundamental questions about the intentions both in taking the documents and in using them after they're taken. So I certainly believe these are stories that are worth pursuing, as indeed the journalistic world will pursue them. But I think they should alert the public to the fact that there is increasingly more than has already met the eye about both the content of these documents, the way in which they were handled, and obviously the intentions of Trump and those around him who took them improperly, one could argue at this point illegally, from the custody that they belonged in with the National Archives and the U.S. government.
Well, indeed, the National Archives were in a long battle with Trump all of 2021 and 2022 to get back their stolen property.
Indeed, they were. And one other fact worth noting in the reporting out today about a letter that was sent from the archives, a letter specifying that they retrieved between January and the search of Mar-a-Lago 15 boxes. So if you do the math, we're talking about 15 plus 11, we're talking about 26 boxes, 26 file boxes, I assume, of material that came from the White House. That's an enormous quantity of paper. And it should make this an even more important issue for the Bureau to pursue, just simply based on the volume of what they brought into the public eye as in Trump's improper possession, not just the question of how high the classifications are or how they were handled.
So there's a real possibility that the top secret stuff, the SCI stuff, was related to nuclear weapons. There's been all kinds of reporting on that, and the Washington Post is standing by their reporting on that. When Trump sat down with Bob Woodward for the book Rage that Woodward wrote about him, Trump boasted to a reporter about the most top secret stuff that the U.S. has in terms of a new generation of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons delivery systems, which Trump said are so far ahead of anything the Russians and the Chinese had, etc. So that's a fairly scary indicator. I mean, he seems to have a morbid fascination with nuclear secrets at any rate. Is it possible that he took some of that stuff with him? I mean, that stuff would be worth trillions of dollars to the Chinese and the Russians, because even if it turns out that he didn't send these documents off or didn't monetize them, sell them to the Russians or the Chinese or whatever, the very fact that nobody quite knows about the chain of custody of these documents in the intelligence community, doesn't that mean that the information is already considered compromised?
Well, I think the judgments that are being made in the intelligence community are probably ones that are defensive in nature, and I certainly wouldn't doubt that people now are very concerned about the security of that information, whether they reach the conclusion that it is, as you just put it, compromised at this point. I certainly have no insight into their current thinking, but prudence would dictate that they would look very carefully at what the disclosure of a part or whole of any such document that the FBI now has in its possession would mean for the security of either the systems or the information base or the sources that document could reveal. But let me also step back a bit from what has been reported and what has captured most attention among the various things that could have been in the 11 or could be in the 11 boxes of material the FBI carted away, and really look at Trump, the personality. As you pointed out, and I think you're absolutely on the money, as an authoritarian aspirant who loves things like Bastille Day parades rolling down Pennsylvania Avenue in the place of normal 4th of July celebrations, Trump doubtless is fascinated by the biggest bangs for the buck that the U.S. defense establishment has produced. But Trump also is someone who has nothing more nor less on his mind 24 hours a day than his own self-aggrandizement commercially and in terms of the success, quote unquote, of his business enterprises. And when you look at the way in which the absolutely outrageous insinuation of Trump's business interests into the affairs of state that he was responsible for as the president occurred, whether it was Trump's ludicrous presentations to Kim Jong-un about how North Korea could be developed commercially as a tourist location if Kim only signed on to Trump's nebulous to non-existent proposals for denuclearization, or it was his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, somehow, and I just can't imagine how this possibly could have happened after his brilliant maneuvers to help create the Abraham Accord, coming up with $2 billion from the Saudi investment fund when all New York banking and investment circles turned him down. You have to step back and ask yourself the question, not just about what Trump might disclose through his recklessness to the Russians or the Chinese or any, shall we say, standard adversary, but how he might turn classified information or proprietary information or highly secret intelligence information into money-making propositions. Let's just stop for a minute. Proliferation and the use of information about risk and threat what would be of interest to, say, the Saudis if there was, and I'm totally speculating, I have no knowledge, I have spoken with no one, I have been away from the kinds of secrets that I'm about to suggest could be in the boxes carted away by the FBI, but what would be in the interest of the Saudis to learn about, say, what we collected about the Iranian nuclear program that we have kept under lock and key because of the sensitivity of our means of collection or our sources? What might be of interest to people with respect to our intelligence on how, say, Gulf state internal politics are playing out based on our close defense relations with the Gulf states and the Saudis, who are not always sleeping in the same bed? Let's look at the things that Trump could do to benefit his presence, to be able to use his trading cards. This is something that is not just simply idle speculation on my part. It's been built into, it's been endemic in his administration and the kinds of personalities that have skirted the line or crossed it in terms of their own commercial interests. If I were going to speculate about what was in those boxes that Trump wanted to be able to use, I would look first, or at least I would look at the same time at his commercial use of this, his ability to exploit it to his own ends, to include against his enemies, by the way, politically here in the States, as he sees them, as much as I would what he might disclose to his fist-bumping buddy, Vladimir Putin.
And again, I'm speaking with Kent Harrington, a former senior CIA analyst who served as National Intelligence Officer for East Asia and Chief of Station in Asia, and he has an article at Project Syndicate, Trump's Blackmail Defense. So, Kent Harrington, I've been looking into a story that came from a reliable source that the FBI had been conducting a criminal investigation into a Russian woman who was a regular visitor at Mar-a-Lago. This was for the last 6 months, and they initially thought that she was just a grifter down there to see what she could find. You know, obviously Trump being the king of grifters, Mar-a-Lago was grifter central. But then about 2 months ago, the FBI's counterintelligence division took over from the criminal division and became a CIA investigation based upon the possibility that this woman is what the Soviet KGB would refer to as a Red Sparrow. And apparently she's been playing golf with Trump and with Lindsey Graham, and that may be why they moved on Mar-a-Lago to seize the documents, because they were concerned about her. Have you heard anything to that effect?
I would be anything but surprised if that turns out to be the case as you've just described it. The answer directly is I have no insight into that story. It's certainly plausible in terms of the history of Mar-a-Lago as a Disneyland for intelligence services. Let's just simply put the story your source or sources have provided against the backdrop of the Chinese who was rolled up with all kinds of electric paraphernalia that she was carrying into Mar-a-Lago. Let's simply look at Trump's behavior in public when, for example, during North Korean missile activities, he was having dinner in the dining room with Prime Minister Abe and several others, and in a parade ground voice was discussing what we knew and didn't know, or what the information then coming in about that particular North Korean escapade was all about. Let's just simply look at a place that there had to be arm twisting in Trump's entourage to have his sensitive compartmented information facility built so that what he had there as president could be properly protected, and then his behavior, which goes without saying, is a risk in and of itself as a sort of psychotic ego. That the Russians would not be exploiting this would be mind-boggling to me. If they are in the way you've described it, and it was a catalyst for investigation, well, the Bureau is and all of its supporting elements in the rest of the national security community, in my opinion, would be doing their job.
So just in the last couple of minutes then, Kent Harrington, in your article at Project Syndicate, Trump's Blackmail Defense, you mention how the former head of the CIA, John Deutsch, he was discovered that he routinely stored highly classified intelligence on an unsecured personal computer that also allegedly he used to surf internet porn sites. And he, of course, lost his security clearance, lost his job, but Bill Clinton pardoned him. And in 2005, Sandy Berger had to pay a $50,000 fine, lost his security clearance, and lost his law license as well for taking out, stuffing documents from the National Archives in his pants. And then in 2015, David Petraeus, of course, pleaded guilty for security breaches when he allowed his biographer turned mistress to see notebooks containing secrets that would have done exceptionally grave damage if they were leaked. So these are the deals that have been made. Do you think there's a deal that the DOJ might end up making with Trump? In other words, you don't run for president again, but we won't put you in jail.
I would be surprised if Trump's attorneys, assuming, and we're making a lot of assumptions here, that this investigation turns up the kinds of national security information in Trump's hands improperly and basically illegally that has been suggested to date. I would be surprised if Trump's attorneys weren't the ones who were banging on the door sooner rather than later to talk about deals and arrangements. Whether a deal would reach that kind of negotiation over Trump's future, I think, is not something that I would see put in the way you just described it. The fact is, Trump being convicted, if indeed the investigation led to an indictment and the indictment led to court, of a felony for the kind of violations of law that would be required, would be the kind of political price, so to speak, he would pay that would, I think, be a factor if he chose to run again in 2024, irrespective of whether under the Constitution or picking any other political precedent you might want to find, there were reasons for him not to run put forward by his allies or supporters. But that the Justice Department would bargain over him not running, it just seems to me to be something that would be not on the table, let's put it in those terms. What the Justice Department faces is the dilemma of having to make its case, whether it's in negotiations with the attorneys of the accused or whether it's in court if those negotiations fail, running the risk that the information included that the defense would demand be put on the table in any legal proceedings would be compromised. And that is just the dilemma, almost in a way, the contradiction in how the laws that protect our secrets work in a democracy where we have a government of laws and not men, and where everyone is equal under the law. However much it might make someone grind their teeth given Trump's behavior, the defense that he would have all the right to demand the public disclosure, whether or not it ever came to that, of the information that they were, the government, that is the prosecution, was alleging he compromised. And that is the prosecutor's dilemma. So I find myself focused more in my speculation, and I stress this is speculation. I'm not operating on anybody's inside information, on the intricacies, if you will, and the dilemmas posed by the law than on any grand political bargains that might come out of a negotiation at the highest level over Trump's fate.
So in other words, if, as it's been alleged, that Trump squirreled away top secret national security documents, you're saying that the very disclosure of those documents in open court would be so damaging to the U.S. that they would basically let Trump off. In other words, Trump would be able to use the value of the secrecy as a defense against the fact that he stole them in the first place.
Well, that's the kind of, for lack of a better term, blackmail that is part and parcel of negotiations, whether it's put overtly and explicitly on the table by the parties involved or not. And that's the dilemma that the prosecutors face. If indeed, and again, we're only operating on one set of reports, the Washington Post reports, and whatever else has been supporting of those in other media, with respect to the high level of classification and the sensitivity of the documents that are reported to be or alleged to be in the FBI's cache. If those documents don't reach that level, it doesn't mean that this same tactic won't be applied on the part by the defense. And if I were there, I'm not a lawyer, but if I were Trump's lawyer, that's the road I would go down, because I would demand to have the government prove that the case against my client was at the level of transgression that required the penalty he was being called to court for. But the fact of the matter is that is the dilemma built into any case, it seems to me, that requires you to follow the letter of the law and to the procedures they're under.
Well, Kent Harrington, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
It's my pleasure, Ian. Great to talk to you.
And again, I've been speaking with Kent Harrington, who was a former senior CIA analyst who served as National Intelligence Officer for East Asia and Chief of Station in Asia, and he has an article at Project Syndicate, Trump's Blackmail Defense. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back assessing whether Trump has the Samson complex and could, when it came to the crunch, tear down the temple around him, given his not-so-veiled threats to instigate civil war should he be indicted.